Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Dr. Matthew Nagra. I hope I can call you Math or Matthew. I don't know what you prefer, or
Matt. Yeah, Matt
Matt.
is fine.
Perfect.
Yeah.
We'll keep it as simple as that. So it's my utmost pleasure to have you here and to talk to you about many different topics that I can promise to the listeners. But before we actually start doing that, if there are certain people out there that actually don't know you and don't know what you're actually doing, why don't you actually introduce yourself to the community a little bit?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a naturopathic doctor in Vancouver, BC. So obviously we're on opposite ends here. And I focus a lot on nutrition in my practice. Obviously online, that's a lot of what I do. Although I will be posting some stuff shortly here about like exercise. So yeah, I get outside nutrition a little bit as well. But my main goal really is to clear up a lot of the confusion, the myths, the misconceptions around nutrition. Obviously, entering into some debates, which I know we'll talk about shortly. And if anyone wants to, follow along with a lot of that stuff, you can follow me on Instagram or really any social media. But Instagram is the one where I'm most active.
Yeah, we'll make sure, obviously, to link all your social, whether you're watching this on Instagram, TikTok, or kind of like YouTube, which you're on every platform there is, I feel like. So
Yeah.
perfect. All right, then speaking of a copyright strike, basically, or a debate, you recently had a very interesting debate, which I recommend everybody listening to this that goes to watch the whole 2.5 hours between you having a debate with Dr. Anthony Jeffy, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, hosted by Lauren Knight. Now, I watched the whole debate, I feel like 3 times, which it gets more and more interesting the more I watch it, to be honest. But before we talk about what happens afterwards, why don't we actually just talk about your experience with the debate and kind of like you sharing what you thought about it?
So this idea for the debate actually came up. Lauren had messaged me at some point wanting to like interview me, and then we chatted about that. And then she brought up the idea, hey, would you be interested in debating, one of the, say, carnivore docs? And I was like, I've asked them all. I've already asked them. They don't seem interested. And she's like, what's really funny is they say the same thing. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like I have screenshots of comments and messages and stuff of them like avoiding, actual debates. And so she must have taken that back to Chafee, I'm assuming, because she'd interviewed him before, and they must have, a bit of a relationship that way. At least they know each other. And she was able to get him on board with a debate. And so, great, we were going to do that. And previously, months earlier, Chafee and I had gotten to a bit of a text, comment debate on Instagram about his claim that plants are trying to kill you, right? That you eat plants, they poison you, that sort of thing. And so I suggested, let's focus on that topic. I want to really hammer that specific topic or that specific argument, because that's where we left off when he essentially ghosted me after a bit of back and forth. So I wanted to follow up on that discussion we had about the plants trying to kill you sort of topic. And so Lauren and I had some back and forth about setting up that topic. It was a bit confusing because I thought we had agreed on that topic, but then when I got the invitation to, like, the official invitation, the Google invitation, whatever you want to call it, there's all these other questions, like all these other random topics. And I was thinking, where did that come from? So I responded, asked, never got no message back. And then Chafee and I were DMing, and he wanted all these other topics to come into. And this is something I notice a lot with the sort of carnivore crowd, is they never want to focus on a single topic. They always want it to be broad. I think it's a lot easier to jump around as well that way. So after much back and forth, eventually it sounded like he agreed to focus on this topic. And then I told Lauren that literally the morning of the debate, I think, is when she finally responded. But then when we started the debate, this was all cut out at the beginning of the debate, before it actually started. It sounded like, no, Chafee actually wanted to cover everything. It was very confusing. The whole organization was very, very confusing. And the other issue was I was the one that requested we share our references. Now, you watched the debate, right? And you probably noticed that he said he didn't get my references, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is what actually happened. I sent my references 2 weeks earlier to Lauren because I didn't have Chafee's email. So I sent them to Lauren to email to him. And a week before the debate, Chafee and I were in Instagram DMs, and I told him I emailed them to Lauren, right? I was like, to pass on to you. He never told me he didn't receive them at that point, right? So if he cared enough to actually see them, I would have assumed he would have been like, oh, hey, I haven't gotten them. Email me directly. Here's my email. But he didn't do that. I found out the morning of the debate that Lauren was out of cell range. She was at like Burning Man festival or whatever for those couple of weeks because they got like rained out or flooded or something and they couldn't leave. So I did make an effort to share my references. They just didn't get to him, and he never told me they didn't get to them. So I thought it was very shady to use that as an excuse for not knowing my references. And on the other hand, he didn't send me anything either. I just knew all his talking points. That was the difference. I knew what he would say, and I knew the evidence, countering a lot of that. Or heck, I knew a lot of the evidence or the research that he was even citing that actually supported my position, but he didn't realize that, I guess, or whatever. So that's just to give some context. I feel like people are missing that piece. I saw a lot of comments like, oh, you guys should have shared references. Look, I tried. That was my call. I'm the one who requested that we do that, but it just didn't happen for reasons beyond what I could do, so, but anyways, I know you wanted to know about the debate itself. That was just kind of a preamble, but yeah, as far as the debate, I mean, you can still watch it on Lauren's channel. I guess she's cut out some stuff a little bit. She cut out portions where she started debating me as the moderator. And she obviously filed a copyright strike to get it taken down from mine. I'm still not sure why. We can get more into my speculations around that. But yeah, I'd like to hear just from you a little bit as a viewer, like what you thought of the debate.
What actually kind of like really shocked me positively was, as I was watching the debate, I thought like you were kind of like sharing the studies before because you knew all his talking points and you were addressing all kind of like the flaws in his arguments, every single one of them. Then I came across the information that you weren't actually you didn't share the studies beforehand. And I was like, what the hell? How did Matt know all this stuff beforehand? Like, it's super impressive. So from my standpoint, honestly, if you have, I consider myself to have a very superficial knowledge about the scientific research. I know certain points that you have to look out for, and so on and so forth. And when you have a superficial kind of like scientific knowledge and you watch a debate, I can honestly not understand how Dr. Anthony Chafee makes all the points that he makes. If I were to boil it down to, and feel free to either agree or disagree, if I were to boil down to his arguments, it seems to me like it all comes down to the kind of like our ancestors ate it. We were biologically designed to eat meat, and my patients though. And that's it. So anecdotes and ancestors ate a meat-based diet.
Well, it's not even an opinion really there, because he said that. He said that in the debate near the end, right? He said he doesn't care about the studies. He said that, or at least if he didn't say that in the debate, he said it previously. But he said at the end that his main crux of his argument was this idea that all of his patients are getting better. Now he made some claims. He said everything gets better. And he's like literally saying every disease out there is like, okay, that should be a red flag for anybody. But he said that at the end, right? He doesn't actually really care too much about the research itself, which also raises the question, well, why do you cite research at all? That's one thing. Anytime he cites something on any like social media post or whatever, you could just be like, well, you've already said you don't care about the research. Why are you citing it? So he kind of shot himself in the foot a little bit.
That's a common theme I see among all the carnivore doctors, to be honest. I made also a couple of posts about Paul Saladino, about Sean Baker, and at some point they all stated that's what they all have in common. And that's not me being biased. That's what they literally are saying. Epidemiology studies are pointless or garbage, and they basically go and start citing epidemiology studies multiple times when it suits their bias. And this is what I found very conflicting, because I was also baffled, and I was about to bring up exactly that point. Dr. Anthony Jaffe stated at the end that he doesn't really care about science. He cares about what happens in his kind of like field. That he does when he works with the patients, which obviously should be appreciated. This also kind of like what baffles me is that Dr. Anthony Jaffe, he cites studies during the whole debate. So it was basically about 2 hours of citing studies, random book references, and kind of like arguing about how his studies are better or kind of like better quality than the studies you cited. And at the end, he kind of like backs it up and says, well, I don't care about science. Why even bring up the scientific studies when you don't care about it? That doesn't make any sense.
And there's this whole idea throughout, and this was from both him and Lauren, that there's studies on both sides, right? Now, if there's one thing I'm disappointed with, as far as my own performance in the debate, and I tried to hit on this at the end, but Lauren cut me off. This was the idea that there's studies on both sides, so you can't really pick a side, so to speak. What I tried to get across was like, look, we have the same thing with smoking, but the better data tells us that smoking increases lung cancer risk, and other diseases, but we'll focus on lung cancer. There are actually a handful of studies that suggest it either has a neutral effect or is beneficial for lung cancer risk. No one in their right mind is going to look at that and say, oh, well, we don't know what the result is. We're just going to have to think that smoking is neutral or it's unclear. No, we look at the study methodology. Were they considering other confounding variables? How long was the follow-up? How much were they smoking? What was the difference? Was it people smoking 5 cigarettes a day versus people smoking 6? Or was it people not smoking at all versus people who smoke 2 packs a day? And it's the same thing with a lot of this nutrition research. Is you have to look at like, what's the contrast? Are we comparing people eating, half a serving a day to 3/4 of a serving a day of vegetables? Or are we, looking at basically none to, 3-4 servings a day? Are we considering exercise, smoking habits, physical activity, or I already said exercise, but you get it, all the different confounders. When you do that, we get a very clear picture. And that's the point that I would have liked to have gotten across the most. But like I said, I just got kind of cut off when I tried to get into that point.
Absolutely. I mean, we can even find great data. Well, not great, but we can find plenty of data. That's a better word suited here that states that obesity actually leads to better health outcomes.
Yeah, plenty. At least for overweight, if not obesity, like overweight for sure.
That's also one of the reasons why many people think, well, see, epidemiology studies suck.
Yeah.
Like, no, they don't suck. You just have to kind of like understand how to read them even on a superficial level. If you know a couple of things, you can easily point out to certain things which should be looking out for. And once you do that, it kind of like paints a pretty clear picture on what studies actually really show. So playing devil's advocate a little bit, well, not really, but if I were now to put you in the shoes of Dr. Anthony Jaffe, what do you think was his strongest argument during the debate?
Oh, God. I don't know, because I don't think there was really anything I couldn't respond to. I mean, it's tough because, if he had pivoted he did pivot his position a bit, but if he had pivoted from, an all meat diet is the best and that plants are essentially harmful, to something like, this diet that he's recommending is perhaps, and even that's questionable, but perhaps better than like a standard American, let's say, maybe he would have an argument. And I think that's still a weak argument. I actually think the carnivore diet would probably still be worse. But like maybe there would be some way to formulate a good argument there, but he didn't even do that. What I thought was really funny was he said that his whole idea of the plants are trying to kill you lecture was just to inform people that they have to prepare foods properly. They have to cook beans to eat them and stuff. And I don't think watching his lectures on that, I don't think that's the picture that gets painted. Personally, I think it's a lot more of like, no matter what, you're gonna hurt yourself by eating these foods. But yeah, I don't know. I can't think of a really strong argument that was presented.
I also thought about it, especially considering that I try also to be or look at the data from a very objective point of view. Although, again, we are all biased. Whether we wanted to admit it or not, we are all super biased.
Say that all the time. Yeah,
absolutely. When you look at the scientific research, you kind of want to put on the objective glasses. So I watched the debate a couple of times, not just because I felt like, wow, great arguments from you, but I wanted to watch it again and again and again to see what were truly his arguments. I agree with you. I couldn't find any. You knew every argument that he was going to bring up. You knew the flaws of that argument, and you made him actually admit multiple times that you are right, which also kind of like was super surprising coming from, at least from Dr. Anthony Jeffrey, which I've interacted with very briefly. He commented on underneath one of my posts, which I made about him, about stating that fibers, plant are toxic and stuff like that. And I also started arguing with him a little bit here and there. But again, as I was kind of like addressing his claims, I also didn't get any response back, basically.
One of the issues is, or maybe one of the things I did well, I think in the debate was I asked him questions where, there's only really one reasonable answer a lot of the time, or things where it's like something is objectively true or false, based on the study. Like, the right out the gate, you can see me actually smile a little bit in the video when he brings up the UK Biobank study on the vegetable intake and cardiovascular disease, because he ignored that there was a reduction in all-cause mortality. So right out the gate, I was like, why'd you ignore that? And he didn't really have a response for that. And then obviously when I gave him the hypothetical, by the way, the diet A, diet B, it's great. It's so good because it really does bring forth like, what do you value? And if you value our ancestors did it though, or biological adaptations though, or whatever, over better health outcomes, it's just insane. There's really only one good answer, and that's how you bring the discussion to health outcomes, which is what should matter. But he refused to answer. I think there was like Lifting Vegan Logic did a sort of a recap video or a highlight video or whatever, and I think he put a counter for how many times he tried to avoid the question. It was like 8 times or something. But stuff like that, where like you can only answer it one way, and that's the other thing, is you have to. One of the comments I got the most, because like you said, nobody actually brought up arguments in my comment section either for things that he did perhaps better. It was all just like, oh, Matt's interrupting. I was like, well, yeah, you won't answer the question. So I was like, dude, you're not answering the question. Please answer this question. And I had to do that multiple times. That's what people don't understand, is when you're in these debate situations and someone is avoiding questions or they're misrepresenting you. They're saying, oh, Matt believes this, but I don't actually believe that. I'm totally in my right to butt in and be like, actually, just to clarify, that is not what I believe. So that was like the one negative that seemed to be consistent from at least the more carnivore side throughout the comments.
That's what I read through the comments as well. It was filled with anecdotes, and just like you basically attacking you as a character either, or you kind of like were misbehaving in the debate, and some even used the word aggressive. You were super
Yeah.
aggressive. And I rewatched it again and was like, no, it's not super aggressive. You just want to get an answer out of it, because that is what a debate is all about.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm asking you a question and you're avoiding it all the time, that's not a debate. That's just a discussion, right? We are here to debate about a certain given topic. And if you want to get an answer out of your question and you don't get those answer, you have to circle back and like, no, please answer the question.
Yeah. And like, it was a 2.5-hour debate. Like, here's the alternative. The alternative is I ask the question. He gives a long 1-2 minute, whatever kind of response that doesn't address the question. And then I say, we'll get to that. But again, I'm going to ask this question. He gives a long 1 to 2 minute response. Doesn't answer the question. I say, okay, again, we'll get to that. We'll go back to the question. And I do that 8 times, perhaps, instead of just butting in after it's clear that he's not answering the question, and just, you know, addressing the question again. That's what a lot of these people don't understand, is like, there was purpose. I mean, were there some times where maybe I could have not butted? Hey, sure, whatever. Maybe there were a handful of times, but I think the vast majority were warranted, for the reasons I just kind of presented.
So, Matt, there was drama before the debate, during the debate, and after the debate. Why don't you actually tell us what happened after the debate? I believe 2 weeks after you posted.
Yeah. So the debate happened, but the debate happened almost a month before I even posted it. And so obviously Lauren was like moderating. She had recorded the debate. I asked her for the files for the debate as well, which she was happy to share. I was going to make like shorts out of it, or clips, so that they're ready to go. But her video was missing a good chunk of the debate. The recording software had messed up. Fortunately, I had also recorded it on my end, again, just to make sure nothing is cut, you know, and whatnot. So I actually stitched it all together for her. I was like, hey, you're missing this, 20-minute chunk here. I put it in. I fixed the audio delay. Did all the work on that. I actually had a friend do it who works in that area. So it was like super, good quality, ready to go. And I sent it back. And I was like, when do you think this, will go out? Her response wasn't super clear on that. It didn't, I think she didn't understand what I had done. Maybe she hadn't watched over the video yet or something. So I responded again to like clarify, like, no, we're fixing the video. Your video is messed up. It doesn't have everything, but it's good to go now. When are you posting? And then she just sort of said like, well, I imagine it'll be sometime in the next month. And this was 2 weeks after the debate, right? And the video is good to go. So I was thinking, well, when you say you imagine it'll be in a certain time frame, that's not a very clear timeline. So I thought, okay, maybe she's still figuring out schedule. I emailed a week later again. I was like, hey, do you have a more firm, idea of when you'll be releasing this, so I can plan accordingly? Ideally, I'd like it out by the end of the week. This was at, it's already been like 3 weeks since the debate at this point, and the video is good to go. So I asked again, like, do you have a more firm date? I also had a lot of people for weeks pestering me about this debate, wanting it out, right? And got no response at all. She also doesn't generally, or at least to me, wasn't responding to like Instagram messages and stuff. Well, at this point, because she's also a more carnivore proponent, animal-based eater, she doesn't say strictly carnivore, but pretty close. And so I'm thinking, and many other people, friends of mine, were thinking, because they had seen my recording of it, I shared it with them, that this video was not going to go up. Or was going to be edited or something. And so so at a point I was like, okay, well, she hasn't responded to me in 2 weeks. I've asked multiple times for a release date. I'm just going to release it. Whatever. So I put it up on my channel, and my channel's not monetized, by the way. So I'm not making any money off it. That's one of her accusations, was that I'm like taking her ad revenue. I'm not. So then she emails me the next day, and she's like, well, why'd you put it up? We should have coordinated. Like, she was okay with me putting it up, just as long as we had coordinated a release date and released at the same time. And I was like, I tried. What are you talking about? Check your email. It's like, I've been trying for weeks now. And she's like, if you wanted to release it earlier, I could have worked with you on that. Again, please check your emails, because we talked about that. And then I explained that, and her follow-up emails got more and more aggressive, and she started accusing me of stealing ad revenue. I was like, I'm not monetizing my videos. I'm not stealing anything. She ignored that. She still claimed that I was stealing ad revenue. And I was like, look, because the ad revenue, as you know, is not going to be a lot for a single video. It's going to be probably like $20 or something. Like I don't know what the difference between her views and mine would be for that. It's probably not very much. And so I even said, I was like, look, if you can just estimate the ad revenue you would have gotten from my views, I'll just pay you that. Like, I don't care. And this wasn't because I think I was in the wrong. This is just because like it's such a small point. I just want the video out there for people. I wanted it out there for a month at that point. And she ignored that offer. I offered that 3 or 4 times in subsequent emails too. She ignored it every time. And then she threatened to have her lawyers come after me. And I was like, well, go ahead and spend the legal fees. Like, I don't know what, if you're worried about ad revenue, I don't know how that's worth it. And then eventually she filed the copyright strike. And for anybody who's aware, a YouTube copyright system is pretty broken in that if you file a copyright strike on a video, it gets taken down basically 100% of the time, at least until it gets resolved. So that's what happened here. It's not because she is right in doing so. It's because the system is built that way. So that's what happened with all of that. Now I have my theories perhaps around why she wanted it taken down, because the financial part doesn't make any sense given that it wouldn't be very much. And I literally offered to pay the difference multiple times, which was ignored every time. I think she edited out stuff where maybe she didn't look as good. Like she edited out portions where she started debating me and was visibly angry. She, as far as I know, she cut out like most of the parts where she talked. There was one part where both she and Chafee interrupted me simultaneously, speaking of interruptions. And then she starts arguing with me and whatever. That was cut out. I posted that in my stories on Instagram. So I don't know, but I can only speculate. I'm not saying that that's for sure the reason. It's not even clear to me what the reason is. But this is a false copyright strike. I've already spoken with lawyers. I have friends who are lawyers. We're sending a counter notification and stuff, and it should get resolved hopefully shortly. But for the meantime, it's down. It's still up on her channel, but like I said, there are some chunks missing.
I don't know her. I don't know whether she's a good person, a bad person. If you have trouble, at least I was raised to be this way. If you have trouble with someone before you go to the authorities, so whether we are talking like when we were children to the teachers or to kind of like your employer or whatever, try to talk to that person first and see what's going on. And most of the times you can talk things out in life, most of the times. Mm-hmm. And if you still don't manage to talk things out, well, then, yeah, at least you tried. And I don't understand why you would just file a complaint. I mean, the video is still up. The arguments that you made are still being made, obviously. If she cut out certain parts, I would also kind of like think maybe that's why. But if that was her issue, you seem like a guy to me that she could just have contacted and said like, well, Matt, I was kind of like fired up. Can we agree to just leave out the part in which Atara starts interacting with you and during the debate? And I guess you would have said yes. So
what's really annoying about it too is like when when in our emails, I make clear that the full debate would go up, right? And then when she cut stuff out, I responded. I was like, well, why'd you cut stuff out? And her response was like, I didn't cut anything out. I just cut out blank space. That's just a lie. She didn't just cut out blank space where there was no one talking or stuff like that. Like she actually cut out portions of the debate. So obviously this is here, so people are going to have to just take my word for it at this point. But that's, I mean, you can see the difference in the clips that I posted and stuff. So, hopefully it gets resolved soon, and we can put that behind us for now. But it's just frustrating that it had to get to this at all. Like you said, I was trying to talk, I was trying to work with her. And the reason that I ended up posting anyway was because there was just a lack of communication for weeks at a time when I was trying to figure out, when is this video actually going to come out?
Yeah, considering all the circumstances, I believe you did a really good job again, not just during the debate, but even after the debate. But yeah, let's hope this stuff gets figured out and that the debate will go up in full length soon
Yeah.
again, which I
Yeah.
will, which I guess it will really soon. Let's kind of switch gears and go from the debate to, but stay on the carnivore topic.
Okay.
Because what I feel like gets often brought up is when we talk about red meat, and those are comments that I also see underneath my videos when I'm talking about red meat, and underneath your videos as well. People often make the accusation about that certain studies don't adjust for healthy peoples. Those studies were performed on basically people that just eat junk food and red meat and are not really healthy. That's the first thing that comes up. The second thing that also comes up is that red meat that these people were eating wasn't grass-fed, which is also kind of like interesting. So what do you say to people that make those arguments?
Let's just hit the grass-fed part first, because that's I think easier. So there's literally no reason to think that grass-fed would be meaningfully different as far as health outcomes. The differences in nutritional composition are pretty tiny, and we have a pretty good idea of the components of red meat that are potentially harmful. Things like saturated fat, the cholesterol to a lesser degree, heme iron perhaps, whether that's regarding colorectal cancer or even cardiovascular disease, diabetes. And these are inherent to the meat. Whether or not anything else changes that a little bit, sure, I'll even grant that, hey, maybe there's a very slight difference. It's not going to be a big difference. Now, with the claim that, well, you know, they weren't healthy people, they weren't eating a healthy diet, that's also largely nonsense. I mean, we have numerous, actually most of the studies do a good job adjusting for things like exercise, smoking, BMI, socioeconomic status, different markers of socioeconomic status anyway. And we see that the results are quite consistent if you're looking at people consuming about a serving a day versus people not consuming any or very little. Where you might not see much of a difference is if, let's say, you're comparing people not smoking. I always make the smoking comparison. People eating, we'll say, 3 servings a week versus those eating 2 servings a week of red meat, then yeah, you're probably not going to see a big difference in risk. Now, the study that comes up a lot, this is one that I know Lane Norton has cited a lot, and it seems to circulate as the Tomorrow Alberta Project, or the Alberta Tomorrow Project, whatever the title was. And in this study, what they did was they looked at red and processed meat intake separately, so not combined. And it was cancer risk, and they stratified it by people eating low, moderate, and high amounts of fruits and vegetables. And so they found that those eating the most eating the most vegetables, those also eating the most red meat, did not have a significantly higher risk of cancer. Although those eating processed meat still did. So this leads people to believe that unprocessed red meat is totally fine, and that it's the processed meat that's the problem. However, there are some big issues with this paper. For one, the high intake wasn't even a serving a day. It was quite a bit less. It was for men, if I recall, I'm going off memory here, so I might be a bit off, but for men, I believe it was about 5 servings a week. And for women, I believe it was around like 3.5 or so. I could be off on that. But it wasn't a ton of red meat. The second issue is that they're only looking at, they were looking at combined cancer risks. So either all cancers or 15 pre-selected cancers combined. Now, it's totally possible that red meat increases the risk of like colorectal cancer, perhaps some other gastrointestinal cancers, but then fruits and vegetables lower the risk of other cancers. And therefore, the risk sort of cancels out, so to speak, in those eating the most fruits and veggies and those eating the red meat. But their colorectal cancer risk could still be higher. We actually don't know that based on the way that they did the study. They don't give us the numbers for colorectal cancer specifically. So that's another issue. But the biggest, whoops, my AirPod dropped out. The biggest issue I have with this paper and people citing it is they often say that this means that red meat is harmless, that it doesn't increase risk. Well, it's only looking at cancer. What about our number one killer, or at least America's number one killer, and most places around the world, cardiovascular disease? Why not look at that? And there was a similar study done looking at cardiovascular disease and total mortality. This one found a borderline significant increase in risk for, it was, I think it was cardiovascular disease. Oh no, sorry, it was for mortality. They didn't provide the numbers for cardiovascular disease, but with unprocessed red meat in those eating the most fruits and veggies. There was a Danish study that I've cited a few times, where they stratified by low and high diet quality. So high diet quality was like more fruits, veggies, whole grains, and fish as one of the main protein sources. And they found that those eating a 100-gram serving of red meat per day, unprocessed red meat, had almost double the risk of ischemic heart disease compared to those not eating the red meat. So that is really important to note. And then there's the Zong analysis, 6 U.S. cohorts. This was about 30,000 people, I believe, and they also stratified by diet quality. And we see that red meat is still harmful in those with the higher diet quality. I think what's really interesting about this whole low-high diet quality sort of argument, suggesting that red meat is harmless in those eating a better diet, is that it's actually often the case that we see worse effects or a larger effect on the risk in people with higher diet quality. And I suspect this is because if you take someone with a really low diet quality, for one, chances are the red meat's replacing something even worse. And two, there's only so much risk that is going to accrue from your dietary intake. And, at a point, if your diet's crappy enough, you can add Twinkies on top of that. It's probably not going to do much worse. Whereas if you take people who eat a really clean diet and then you insert something into that diet that can have a negative impact on health, you're more likely to see that increase in risk because there's nothing else crowding it out. You're actually replacing something healthier in that case, which is also what we see with substitution analyses, where you look at the replacement of red meat for like plant protein. It's super consistent that red meat increases risk relative to plant protein intake. So that, I think this whole argument around the diet quality and how red meat is harmless is just really nonsense, honestly.
This brings back good old memories. I believe the report started to come out in 2010 when Dr. Haupt, I believe that's how I pronounce his name, did the infamous, not the famous, but the infamous Twinkie diet, in which he lost many, I don't know how many pounds he lost, but he improved his total cholesterol, his triglycerides, and many other biomarkers improved as well. Mm-hmm. So this brings up another interesting point by what are we replacing red meat with is super important. So let me ask you a really interesting question, because I've read a couple of studies that have done certain comparisons. Refined carbs versus red meat, unprocessed red meat. Mm-hmm. What does the science say regarding which of these food items is healthier?
It would be, depending on the study, it'd be anywhere from like a neutral to leaning towards the refined grains being healthier, generally. At least for these long-term health outcomes. And so there was an interesting study called the Rotterdam study. Now they looked at replacing animal protein with carbohydrates, and the carbohydrates were largely from refined grains. And you see that you're replacing 5% of calories, led to lower cardiovascular and possibly mortality risk. I can't recall if mortality was looked at there. But that was animal protein as a whole. It wasn't specific to red meat. But the JPHC cohort out of Japan, they did the animal protein for plant protein swaps. And when you swap red meat for plant protein, again, you see significant reductions in risk with the plant protein. But almost all of their plant protein came from grains, and largely refined grains. So that was another really interesting one. So generally, when it comes to outcomes, the thing with refined grains that people need to understand is they're generally only, we'll say, harmful in that they're replacing something healthier or they're leading to weight gain. Independent of weight gain, they don't seem to really be detrimental. But red meat does seem to still be detrimental even after adjusting for weight or BMI. So I would lean towards the grains being a healthier option. Now, I'm not saying to replace red meat with refined grains, and I'm not even saying it would be beneficial enough to ever consider that sort of a swap. It'd be closer to neutral, really. I said anywhere from neutral to possibly a bit beneficial. But it is just interesting because refined grains are one that I think most people can accept as not being the best for us, but red meat just seems, no one seems to be willing to accept that one.
So we'll stay on the carnivore topic. Obviously, another food that I see people that are adhering to a carnivore diet eat plenty of is or are eggs. Now, eggs is super controversial, not only on social media, which a lot of things are super controversial on social media, but also in the scientific world. So looking at the best available evidence, what does science say about eggs and health outcomes?
It's very similar to the red meat picture as far as you have to look at how much you're eating and what you're comparing to. So with eggs, where we most consistently see increases in the risk of cardiovascular disease is around an egg a day. Maybe slightly less, slightly more, but around that ballpark. So, one study that I know the American Egg Board loves to cite out of China, and this was about 500,000 people. Obviously, they point to that, huge sample size. But they were looking at the difference of, I think it was 2 eggs a week to 5 eggs a week or something. So really only 3 eggs a week. And in that case, you don't see a significant increase in risk. Plus, eggs in that part of the world are often associated with higher socioeconomic status, which wasn't always considered in a lot of those studies, but at least not to the degree I'd like. But there are at least 3, I think there might be 4 now, studies looking at a sufficient range of egg intake, so closer to none versus closer to 1 a day. And they do consistently find that it increases risk. Now, if you were to do a substitution analysis and look at what the eggs are replacing, you'll find that compared to meat, it's actually beneficial. Compared to plant protein, they increase risk. So it just comes back to that whole idea of you have to look at what you're comparing to, and you have to look at how much we're talking about here. So eggs are, it's hard to say if they're good or bad, healthy or unhealthy, unless you know where they'd be fitting into the diet, what they'd be replacing, and how much you'd be eating.
It all comes down to how much are you eating by the end of the day. I guess that's maybe the biggest takeaway for the listeners, that yes, if you don't care about the ethics and the environmental reasons, which obviously are a huge factor, and I know they are for you and me, you can eat eggs and red meat, but in very, very modest amounts throughout the week. And that's, I guess, the biggest takeaway. And if you're reading a study such as the Alberto studies or studies about eggs, and you look at what quantity they used, or kind of like the wording they use for a lot of egg consumption or a lot of red meat, and you look at it and you kind of round it down to daily consumption, it's usually much less than 100 grams or 1 egg per day.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really the biggest takeaway, I guess, for the listener, that if you look at certain studies telling you that red meat is healthy, eggs are healthy, just look at the quantity that the subjects or participants are eating during those studies. That's a very important metric. Now, staying on the carnivore theme, let me just ask about the other foods. And then I guess we covered all the carnivore foods. And I know I didn't send this beforehand, so hope you're not upset about me, but I know that you're very well versed with this next food item as well. And that is dairy. What can you tell us about dairy? Can dairy be consumed on a daily basis? And if yes, should we be aware of low-fat dairy, high-fat dairy food items? And how much dairy is healthy?
Dairy is a tough one because there's so much variability there. It's not like there's just dairy. There's obviously low fat, there's high fat, there's cheese, there's yogurt, there's butter. And now the one thing I think you can pretty much take to the bank is that butter is going to increase saturated fat risk or increase cardiovascular disease risk because of the saturated fat content, pretty consistently replacing almost anything else that you would be using as like an oil. So other than something that's loaded with trans fats, which fortunately rather, we don't have too much in the food system anymore. So so that one we can set aside. But when it comes to other dairy products, so it depends on how they're made. So if you look at like cheese, for example, cheese actually has a more neutral effect on our blood lipids. It might increase blood lipids relative to like say tofu. There are comparisons there, but tofu also lowers it. There are some studies looking at cheese versus reduced fat cheese. So that'd be cheese without the saturated fat, and the higher fat cheese does raise lipids a little bit. It's not a ton, but a bit. But it actually doesn't have that drastic of an effect given how high they are in saturated fat, or how high cheese is in saturated fat. Yogurt tends to be associated with good health outcomes. If I had to choose between higher or lower fat yogurt, I would probably go for the lower fat versions. For milk, we also see that higher fat milk might increase lipids a little bit as well. Generally still associated with good health outcomes, but you have to look at what you're replacing in that case, going back to what I've already mentioned. But I would say the ones that I would be quite confident about saying that are quite healthy to just include on a regular basis would be things like low fat and fermented dairy products. Now, I would also note that it's not like those benefits are going to be unique to dairy. It's not like you have to consume dairy for those benefits. You can, we have comparisons of like soy milk to even low fat milk, and soy milk still lowers lipids a little bit. We have fermented like plant-based yogurts and things as well that would likely provide some of the similar benefits to the dairy yogurts. But if someone were a dairy consumer, yeah, I think those are the ones generally to stick to.
If you're replacing dairy, make sure to eat enough calcium.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's something I tell all my patients. I was like, look, you need to be focusing on, a couple cups worth of plant-based milks a day, or ideally, or potentially even a supplement if you're not into consuming those foods. But making sure that your calcium intake is adequate for sure.
Speaking about calcium, is what I tell also my clients is a super easy way to get your calcium in without even thinking about it is through mineral water. There are certain brands which are super high in calcium. Like I'm drinking a brand which on a 1 liter basis has 475 milligrams of calcium in it. So I don't really need to fortify it or to buy fortified foods, or basically. So that's another cheap alternative to get your calcium in without you having to worry about it, because we are drinking water anyway. So whether you want it or not, you need to drink water. So yeah, just wanted to point it out, but really good points as well. And that's actually a great segue to my next question that I have for you. It looks like on a superficial levels that animal-based foods are, if you consume kind of like a decent amount of it, not really good for health outcomes. Are there certain foods or animal-based foods that you can recommend people eating maybe more than one serving a day?
You mentioned like low-fat dairy would be one that would be healthier. Fish would be another one that would be healthier. Outside of that, I mean, I'm trying to think of what other animal foods really would be mainstays in a diet. I think that really covers them, because meat, I certainly wouldn't suggest having even a serving a day, let alone more. Eggs, same sort of deal I mentioned. Unless if you're replacing meat with eggs, well then maybe, because it would be on the healthier side if that's the sort of swap that you would go for. But yeah, I would say there aren't really too many others I can think of right now.
Do we actually have good other quality data looking at not only fish, but the other marine life, such as oysters, for example, or shrimps, etc.?
So that's actually not an area I've looked at too much, but that's something that I could look into. I'm not too sure what we have. I know like nutritionally, as far as like zinc content and whatnot, they can be pretty good. They can provide some omega-3s and whatnot too, but not sure about the health outcome data.
Speaking about fish, an argument that I see people doing, actually also from people that are following the carnivore diet, what they usually bring us is that seas, oceans are contaminated, and so is fish. Ergo, fish is unhealthy for us. What do you say
I think
about
we
that?
get that out of the plant-based community too. It's not just the carnivore community, but you have to look at the health outcome data. So even if it is the case that fish is somewhat contaminated, we see that fish consumption still leads to better health outcomes. We even have substitutions with plant protein suggesting it's neutral to, I mean, there's a couple studies that suggest plant protein might be slightly beneficial relative. You know, I would, if I had to pick one, I'd still probably lean towards the plant protein sources a bit, but generally speaking, like it's a pretty neutral swap, and when replacing plant protein sources, and beneficial when replacing other animal protein sources. So if they contain some sort of toxic contaminants or whatever you want to call them, they can't be that bad, or in the concentrations that would be that bad, or there are other components in the seafood that are countering those negative effects, because they're generally leading to better outcomes.
Super important to look at health outcomes, because we can make the same argument about oats and glyphosate. People make the argument all the time, at least it's all over the internet, that oats are contaminated with glyphosate, and thus they have other pesticides in them, and they are super unhealthy for you to eat. But if you zoom out a little bit and you look at the health outcome data, what do we see? We see that oats are very health beneficial for you. So that's a very important point to make. So let's lean back a little bit and let's get away from the nutritional topics that we covered. And let's get a little bit personal, if you don't mind. Obviously, for the listener that are just listening to this and not watching this, they cannot see your great shirt that you're wearing, kind of like stating plant strong. So my questions for you are, how long have you been vegan, and what made
So
you
I've
go
been vegan for almost 13 years now. It'll be 13 years in February. And I didn't go vegan until I was in university, but before that, a couple of years before, when I was about 15, my personal trainer really recommended a plant-based or plant-predominant diet. And there was a time when he and his wife, who trained me as well, wanted me to do a food diary for, I think it was 2 weeks. And I was just really scared that they were going to like see how bad my diet was, and they were going to work me extra hard in the gym and that sort of thing. It was really stupid, the whole reasoning behind it. But I decided to make some changes then, just to sort of trick them, at least temporarily. And so I didn't lie on the food diary, but I actually changed my diet a bit. I got rid of dairy. I reduced my meat intake. I ate way more fruits and veggies, doing lots of like smoothies and things like protein powder and whatnot. And what else did I change? I think those are the main changes. And I started feeling better. I started losing weight. My skin seemed to be clearing up. Like I just noticed all these benefits myself, and I find that's how a lot of people start. At least when it's more for a health reason, they experience something, and that's one way I can sort of sympathize with a lot of the carnivores, right? Is that a lot of them kind of base their position on their personal experience, and so I stuck with it. And over the course of the next couple of years, I just tried to learn more and more. I read more and more. I mean, I certainly went down some roads that aren't so evidence-based as far as people who I was following and learning from, but you got to start somewhere, I guess. Yeah, especially at that age. And eventually, once I got to university, and I was at that point, the healthiest I'd really ever been. I started to, eat cafeteria food again, and it's what was available to me. And I'd be out like drinking on the weekends with friends and things, and I just noticed that I wasn't feeling as good. I wasn't as energetic. Struggled to wake up some mornings for my soccer games on Sunday and whatnot. And so I decided in my second semester, there was just a day where I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna go all in, 100%. And I went 100% we'll say plant-based, not necessarily vegan at that point, because of more of the health side. And then over the next period of time, next year or two, I started to open up a lot more to the ethical considerations. I saw Earthlings. I think that was around when it came out, and eventually just stuck with it more for the ethical reasons, on top of obviously a lot of the health benefits of eating plant-based. But the way I look at it is, like, you can eat 90% plant-based, 100% plant-based, probably not going to make much difference as far as health outcomes. But the ethics are what keep me 100%. And so I've stuck with it ever since, really, and I'm very happy with that decision.
We actually share a quite similar story as well. I wish I had a personal trainer when I started my lifting journey, to be honest, because, oh gosh, I did a lot of things wrong. I'm actually quite lucky that I never injured myself during the 16 years that I've been lifting. And when I say lucky, I truly mean lucky. I did a lot of things that I wouldn't recommend people doing. But I love what you said there. I can sympathize with a lot of people that are adopting a carnivore diet and seeing some health improvements, because that's what happened to me around 16 years ago as well, when I started eating a plant-based diet. My symptoms improved. So just for people that are not aware of, I had inflammation going on in my stomach, basically. So in my colon and in my small intestine, they were both inflamed. And the doctors couldn't really figure out what was going on. I went and saw a lot of doctors. And I always had a feeling that I had to throw up when I ate. So I lost a lot of weight. I didn't eat anything. And we received a small advice from a person that just told us, like, hey, why don't you go plant-based? He actually also used the word vegan. And the word vegan wasn't really known back in the day. People called it strict vegetarian back in the day here, because it wasn't really well known, at least in Switzerland. That's where I'm from. So I went home, and I still remember the very first meal I ate. It was spelt bread with chopped tomatoes and a little bit of olive oil on top of it. I ate it, and it smelled and tasted so delicious to me, and I didn't have to throw up. And that was also my starting point, or where I became super interested. I started working with a dietitian, and she wanted me to eat eggs again, fish, and all this kind of things. And I just told her, like, no, I feel amazing. I want to keep continuing eating a plant-based diet. And so I started doing some research, and I was very surprised that a lot of people are doing really well on kind of like the plant-based diet as well, or at least online. Again, we're talking about 16 years, so it's not like I had all this information at the palm of my hands available to me back in the day, but that's where it all started. And my family was also kind of like concerned as well, until I decided to tell them, like, hey, you know what? I feel good, but maybe you're right. Maybe I'll lack in something. So I won't take any supplements anymore. I didn't take vitamin D supplements, vitamin B12 supplements, and omega-3 supplements, basically, anymore for half a year through winter. So looking back, not something that I would recommend, but I did actually go and made the blood test. And the results came home, and I looked at the results with my whole family, and they were all very surprised and shocked, because that was the best blood test, or CBC, that I ever had in my whole life, except for vitamin D3, B12, and omega-3. Those were all literally in the basement. That's where I feel like, okay, well, that's enough of self-experimenting. I will just take the supplements again. But yeah, that's where basically also my family saw that, hey, this dietary pattern is healthy. So I can sympathize with a lot of people. And I just happen to be lucky, because I can only imagine if someone told me back in the days, hey, eat a carnivore diet, and my health symptoms started to improve. They probably would have not. I don't know. So it's really hard to convince certain people that their lifestyle that they are feeling so good of might not be good long term. So I can kind of like sympathize with that as well. So to close things off, something that interests me and probably a lot of listeners you're very well read when it comes down to scientific studies. For people that are listening to this, I literally just sent you, broadly speaking, some topics that we're going to talk about beforehand, but not about the studies that we're going to talk about, so on and so forth. That was all on top of your head, basically. Why are you so well read? How do you approach the scientific literature? Like, tell us about how Matt basically goes by the day. Do you read them on a daily basis? Do you like to reread certain studies again, revisit them? So why don't you tell us about that?
Like, I didn't prep for this really at all as far as specific studies. And you'll note throughout, there were a few times where I would say, like if I recall correctly, the numbers might be a little off. And I make that clear when I'm doing stuff off the cuff like this. But generally speaking, what I said should be accurate to the what's in the papers. But for the topics that we discussed today, they're just things I've talked about a million times. Eventually you just remember a lot of these things. So it's not like I don't remember everything by any means. I always have to look stuff up. I have a big Google Drive that's almost full, and I'm going to have to probably pay to expand it soon or something. But yeah, so I've got that all loaded up. But as far as my day-to-day, so I don't do this necessarily every day. I try to maybe every other day or so. Is I have some searches lined up on PubMed. So you can make an account with PubMed, and you can actually have like pre-registered searches. So you type out all your search terms for different topics, and I have, I think, 4 or 5 topics in there. One about plant-based diets, one about beverages, so your tea, coffee, sodas, whatever. Then I have one about nutrients like saturated fat, protein, carbs, fiber, and so on. And then I have one about different foods where I list off all the food groups. And then I think I have one other one. So I go to those, and we'll see like how many new ones are published today. And like every day there's like 2,000 or something. Like it's a ton. And then you click on them, and it pulls up the latest for each topic, and you can filter them. So then I filter them down to like, okay, I'm only interested in observational studies, randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, systematic reviews. I don't care about the rodent studies or the in vitro studies, those sorts of things. We can leave those off, and then I scroll through the titles of all of them once I've whittled them down a bit, and I see which ones are actually interesting, and then I'll save them, and then I try to go through them. So obviously it depends on how many interesting ones there are in a day. If there's 2 or 3, then I will read through them that day. If sometimes there's like 7, 8, 9, well then I'll have to save some for another day. But I basically go through them like that, and I try to do that every couple days at least. Sometimes I leave it longer, but if you leave it too long, it adds up to a point that it's a bit overwhelming. So yeah, that's basically how I keep on top. Oh, and then I just follow a lot of really good people. So people who are experts in different fields, they're always going to post whenever they have something new out, or if there's a new big study that maybe didn't show up in my search that is worth looking at. I'll often come across it from these people that I follow, or from friends who will send it to me. Or once in a while, something ends up in the media and it blows up, and then I'll find it that way. But for the most part, I focus on those searches.
One last thing for listeners that are not very well versed or very well read actually with the scientific literature, looking at the study can be very overwhelming. Are there certain small tips and tricks you can give to a layman that they basically can sort out on a very superficial level whether they are looking at a high quality study or a not so high quality study? You already alluded to it a little bit, but I just want people to not that it kind of like gets lost with, I don't like to look at rodent studies and stuff like that. So why don't you actually, if you have a tip, why don't you actually tell people, okay, this is my advice. If you never looked at the scientific research, look out for this.
There's a few things you can look out for. So for one, yeah, is it actually on human subjects? That would be number one. Like, are they looking at humans? A second thing, and this, I want to make clear that none of these are like hard rules. There are exceptions always, but just generally, is it like, what kind of study is it? So is it a prospective cohort study? Is it a randomized controlled trial? or is it like a cross-sectional study? One way that you can sort of figure that out if you're not too sure is like if they talk about a follow-up time. If they're like, oh, people were followed for 8 years or whatever, that probably means it's a cohort study. So that would be a bit better. Cross-sectional studies are just looking at like one point in time, and they tend to not be as good. Again, there are exceptions, but that's sort of a general takeaway. And another thing to look at, without getting into like too many details, I would say, is like how much of a given food, if we're talking about nutrition, like how much are you looking at? So they will usually describe what like high consumption is, and it'll be like more than 500 grams a week or something, or what is low intake? Is it quite different from that high intake? You know, is high intake 500 and low intake 400 a week, or is it 500 versus less than 100 a week? And that would be a better contrast. And so you want to look at the amounts. And like I said, you know, about a serving a day for a lot of these foods, like red meat and eggs, is where we tend to see more harm. So those will be a few takeaways. I'm sure there's more if I thought about it, but it's also hard to provide this info without like overwhelming people too. So hopefully those are helpful.
So just to summarize it, what you just said at the end, if you look at the scientific hierarchy, if you want to call it that way, you want to look at studies that are not done on animals. If you look at observational data, you want to look at prospective cohort studies, so that people have been followed for how many years that has been, or during that study. And randomized control trials, that's super important. And if you look at those studies, make sure that you're looking at the quantity that those researchers are looking at. What does high consumption mean? Is high consumption of red meat 500 grams per week? Is it 1 kilogram per week? And so on and so forth. So that's a really good takeaway for people that want to get a little bit more into the scientific realm. Thank you so much for that. So Matt, thank you so much for taking out your time to do this. I really enjoyed our conversation. If I were to ask you, if you had one wish that you were granted right away, what would you like that wish to be in the nutritional realm that people kind of like would do more or would do less of?
Okay, so before you added the last bit about what like people would eat more or less of, I was thinking I would just end animal ag. That would be my wish. But if it's more about on the individual basis, what people would be doing, I think, I mean, there's the cop-out answer is just like, oh, I dropped my AirPod again. The cop-out answer would just be to increase fiber intake. You know, that would be the simple thing. Another way to sort of frame that with perhaps placing a bit more emphasis on certain types of food would be increasing plant protein intake, because that would usually come with fiber as well. I think either of those would be good options for something like that.
For people that don't follow you, where can they actually find you?
Yeah, you can find me, like you said at the beginning, basically on all the social medias. Instagram's where I'm most active, at least, you know, posting stories and things as well as my main posts. But the main posts or videos usually end up on YouTube and TikTok and all that stuff as well. Not on Twitter too much these days, or X or whatever it's called now, but I'm also on there. And I have a website where I link things like this, so I'll be linking, you know, this video once it's up, as well as some like shorter kind of blog posts as well.
Thank you so much, Matt. I would love to redo this, maybe a part 2, and touch upon many, many different kind of like topics that we couldn't cover in this video. So thank you so much, and yeah, see you guys next time. Welcome everyone, and I already like effed it up in the beginning. So